Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Barbara's Banter. I am Barbara Lang, and my co-host Brian Boyer and I are just delighted to have you join us today. We're going to talk about one of my very favorite subjects, and that is customer service. And I must say, the lack of good service is one of my pet peeves as well. Whether it is folks not timely returning phone calls or responding to emails, or how helpful or responsive a clerk or a cashier is in a store or a server in a restaurant. It's all of the above. We want to have a robust discussion today on this subject, particularly because in the age of COVID, it may have caused some businesses to pivot and what impact that has had on them. We have three terrific guests today and that are really dealing, at least two of them are dealing with this subject in real time. And let me introduce them now. Scott Orlosky. Scott has done a lot of writing and research on customer service excellence that incorporates the voice of the customer, and he's out on the West Coast. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Glad to be here.
Kathy Hollinger, who is a personal friend, I must say, has been the president and CEO of the Restaurant Association of Metropolitan Washington since 2012, where she represents the interest of restaurants and others in the food service industry in the Washington region. Kathy, delighted to have you join us today as well.
Thank you for having me.
And finally, Dann Lee, who is the chef and owner of Anju, a Korean restaurant located in one of the hot spots in Washington, D.C. Dann, we're so glad you're here and look forward to hearing your story as well.
Thanks for having me.
So all three of you, thanks for spending some time for us today on Barbara's Banter. And let's get started. And perhaps the first thing I want to do is let's level set on what your view of customer service is. Because depending on your perspective, and you come from, well, Kathy and Dann are related in terms of the industry. Scott is not. But has some tenets of things that are common across all. Scott, why don't you start? What is your view of what the real definition of customer service is?
Sure, I'll be happy to jump in here. First of all, when we're talking about customer service, it may be self-evident, but we want to define it from the point of view of the customer, because they're the ones that are really grading us. So the customer or the end user, what good customer service means to them is that all of their expectations about the product or service or ease of doing business with you as a supplier were met or exceeded. Okay, that's good customer service. If you're providing world-class customer service, that means that your company has consistently exceeded those expectations. And then the question that comes up is, well, where do those expectations originate? And they originate in the articulation of the promise that you make to your customers. And that's done both very directly through marketing campaigns and advertising and things like that, but also very indirectly through word of mouth or visits to your website. If people have technical questions in the case of manufactured goods like I work with, then all of those create an aggregate feeling of what the customer or end user will expect when they're dealing with you. So you have to articulate your promise and then you have to deliver on that promise. And it's that combination which develops the trust, which is the seed of customer service.
Thank you. So I'm going to pivot to Kathy now, who has to come at customer service perhaps from two different perspectives. One, she runs an organization, a membership organization. And so there's customer service from that perspective. But then, Kathy, talk about it also from your members' perspective. So kind of I throw it to you to define how you look at customer service.
Yeah, so it's so interesting. I mean, we all have such different perspectives in terms of how we define customer service, but for us as an organization that represents owners and operators,
Mhm.
my customers are Dann Lee, are the owners and operators of this incredible industry that is so different than any other industry in the country in terms of market. We are 96% independently operated and owned. But what is most important to my customers is what they are doing every single day, which is making sure they are creating a positive experience, that their priority being customer service in terms of diners coming in, their employees who work for them, everything that we do in the association, we're looking through that lens to make sure that we're bringing them tools, resources, experiences, programming, training, anything and everything that is going to create that robust customer service that is most important to them, which is their diners coming in and out of their restaurants. As you can imagine, over the last year, now it's year plus,
Mhm.
what we needed to rethink was what is the kind of service, tools, resources that are most important in a time of crisis. Interestingly, Danny, I think I was in his restaurant. We had an event like 5 days before the city completely shut down.
Mhm.
Which is so funny to be here full circle, right? 15 months later, and here we're talking about reopening. But what was needed 15 months ago in terms of tools and resources and needs to help my customers, which are the owners, are so very different than what happened or was needed 2 years ago. The question will be, how is customer service redefined as we move forward, which is really speaking to the needs of our owners, chefs, and operators.
So before I go to Danny to answer that same question, what kind of resources, what did your organization do in this age of COVID to help the hundreds of millions, hundreds of members that you have that are part of your organization?
Yeah, so putting aside the trauma and stress that trying to remember all of the things, but let me tell you just the basics of early COVID. One of the very, very first things that we knew and we heard and we did was we created or reimagined the sense of community for our operators. We needed to find a way to be able to communicate with them daily, to be able to give them information, make sure they were in compliance. It was really a rapid response, kind of first responder mechanism to get to our operators quickly, which really resulted in, I would say, I don't know, Danny, maybe twice a day we were sending out pretty comprehensive breakdown of this is what you need to know right now, and this is what you need to do right now, which it was changing every hour upon the hour. Now, as we shift from that customer and what was needed in terms of very time sensitive, real time information, it was also understanding what their customers, which also are their employees, what they needed. We knew that owners and operators had two big priorities at the time: getting some low-hanging relief and immediate access to cash to stop the hemorrhaging, and also to be able to make sure that their people were taken care of, knowing that they had to let go of 80 to 90% of their teams pretty immediately.
Right.
And you know this drill, Barbara. I mean, it was working with the city nonstop to identify, how are we stopping the hemorrhaging? How do we put moratoriums in place? How do we increase allowances to pivot to be able to have them have alcohol to go? Cap these third-party delivery platforms, everything to make sure that every day they are able to keep a little bit of cash in the door, and then also work with our national partners on unemployment insurance and making sure the benefits are robust enough to get them through 3, 4 what we thought was 3 to 4 weeks at that time.
Here we are almost a year and a half later.
Right.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of that immediate thinking in terms of tools and resources, which of course now over the year plus have evolved into much longer term relief and resources and reprogramming of every kind of program we push out as an industry, like Restaurant Week, and helping operators meet their customers where they are in terms of comfort level.
Excellent. I took advantage of the margaritas to go from my favorite Mexican restaurant down the street here. And I was like shocked when they said, oh no, we can do one to go. I said, okay, I want one of those. So it was just odd, very odd. Danny, why don't you first tell us a little bit about your restaurant and then talk about customer service, how you define it, and what changed for you over this past year?
Sure. So we have one restaurant called Anju that you introduced earlier. It's actually the second iteration of a business in the same space that my mother and I opened back in 2006. That was called Mandu, which means dumpling in Korean.
Okay.
We opened up another Mandu location, which is still open down on K Street in 2011. But that original location caught on fire in July of 2017. Literally the same day that I and my business partner, Scott Druno, opened up another concept called Chico, literally the same day,
Wow.
which is crazy. So we took 2 years to kind of rebuild and develop a plan and reopened as Anju. So
Okay.
we have Anju, which is more kind of progressive Korean, I guess is the best way to put it. Mandu, which is more traditional Korean, and Chico, which is more on the fast casual model of half the menus more Chinese focused, half the menus Korean focused. In terms of, what customer service means to someone like myself, we're in the hospitality industry. So that word hospitality is kind of the foundational base of customer service for us. What that means, that's a pretty vague term, but for me personally, it's comfort and safety for our guests. We want to make sure that we're providing a comfortable environment, range not just in terms of the furniture, but the environment and the culture of the restaurant makes anyone from any background feel safe and feel comfortable in our house. We want to make sure that we're providing that same environment. As Kathy said, part of our customer base is our employees, our staff. We want to make sure we're creating a comfortable and safe environment for our staff, who's our family. And, I think especially this past year or a year and a half, the world slowed down a little bit where we were able to really do a lot of self-care almost and take a look at ourselves, at our own companies, at our own restaurants, and see what we could do to be better, to provide more comfort, to provide more safety for our staff and guests. And during COVID, that safety element obviously took on a whole new level.
Absolutely.
Especially with our staff, especially in kitchens, which are tight quarters, supplying PPE, right, was the biggest priority. And if you remember back then, it's not like there was a surplus of masks like there is now. Masks were actually in high demand. Right. So luckily enough, my wife's family owns a beauty supply business where they were actually able to order some masks and send them up to me. And then I was able to circulate them throughout our restaurants.
Oh, okay.
At least make sure that, our staff was able to at least feel safer, during the meetings when there was very little information going around about COVID. And then for our guests, again, the city mandated that all restaurants shut down and only offer takeout and delivery. So for us, it was, okay, how do we make it as comfortable and hospitable and safe environment for the guests to order, right? And also pick up the food. So what we saw, a lot of restaurants just getting, no restaurant expected takeout to be as busy as it was during the beginning of this. And it was insanely busy. So restaurants you saw left and right, huge crowds outside. It was hard to distance the guests. So we quickly had to learn how to manage that safety aspect of getting bombarded with, 20 guests showing up at the same time.
So they were all standing in line for their takeout order?
We're crowding, which was what you do not want in that situation.
Yes, yes.
So,
Yeah.
so we marked off, we took reflective tape, marked off 6 feet, apart lines on the side. When you see those all around the city now, either
Right.
decals or, tape. And then we just had to become a little bit more efficient of how we prepare the orders in our kitchen. So that was more of a streamlined production where we didn't, we wanted the food to be ready right when the guest showed up. We didn't want to have it ready too soon because then it'd be cold, right? And you don't want them waiting because then you cause a situation where you create a bottleneck outside. So
it was a real balancing act that you had to do.
It's a huge juggling act, and especially as the city started to slowly reopen into, patio dining at first, and then 25% indoor dining. You then had to juggle still large amount of takeout orders you were doing. For instance, at Anju, we had never done takeout before.
Right.
We just are, we're fortunately busy enough in-house that our kitchen could not handle doing takeout. So overnight, when the city shut down, we had to immediately switch to a carryout model. So, in order to then transition back to dine-in service, after doing takeout for so long, took some adjustment. But now, we feel good about doing both. And I think most restaurants will continue to do both. Because I think that's the biggest thing is you're not seeing takeout really go away. I think it's here to stay.
Yeah,
Danny, it's interesting too from the customer service point of view, is that you had a very clear focus on comfort and safety, and it's that sort of clear focus that allows you to execute. If you had panicked or tried to do, describe your mission in a more complex way, it would have gotten in the way of you executing what was the core value there of comfort and safety. And I can see that comfort and safety drove you to make a lot of the decisions that you came to, like pivoting to takeout, making sure that social distancing was followed because you had some control over that, making sure that your employees were safe, that they had masks and were, the food industry already has rules in place about sanitary service and that sort of thing. But that clear focus on what it is that you were representing with your food and taking care of your employees and your customers, I think is a key element of what you had to say there.
And Scott, that's such an interesting point because, Danny is one of the most humble restaurateurs I know. They did it right and they did it thoughtfully, and they did it in a way where a lot of other restaurateurs were looking to them to figure out what they were going to do. What I was grateful for is that restaurants, while some were rushing to figure out how to pivot, there were many that stopped and watched before they re-entered whatever their next, 6-month chunk may be in terms of offerings. But, Danny did create a comfort level at his restaurants where, he already had a really strong, loyal diner base. But this only reinforced that, to know that, God forbid, if we're going through any tumultuous time going forward, they are the neighborhood restaurant or the establishment or the restaurant of choice because they are able to trust the comfort and customer service that they would receive. And, we're really lucky to have so many wonderful restaurateurs in this industry, but, you need a few of those anchors like Danny to help others bring them along, to be able to say, they did it this way safely. Let me see what I can glean from this situation to make sure I'm positioned for success as well during this time.
I
Yeah.
always say to people, not just in customer service, but to anything, if somebody else is doing something well, steal shamelessly, and it's okay. You don't go and
Yes,
re
yes, I agree.
reinvent the wheel. So that is great. Brian, you want to jump in? I know you've got some questions too, right?
It's not stealing, it's benchmarking, right?
Oh,
That's what
okay.
it is. It's
Oh,
benchmarking.
good for
Okay.
you. Good for you.
But
Yes.
Scott mentioned when he was talking earlier about expectations of the customers, and the old saying is the customer is always right. But there are obviously situations where the customer is not always right. There are certain expectations that people have. Society has changed. We all come from different backgrounds. We all have different expectations, regardless of the industry that you're in. How do you manage expectations of your customers? And because I don't know if there's a set definition. I mean, I know, it's exceeding expectations, right? As somebody leaving with a positive experience, but everybody kind of has a different definition of what their expectation is. And some people are, if there's an issue, they may be, and this is not just restaurants, this is anywhere, right?
Yeah.
They may be nice about it. They may be constructive about it, or they could be complete jerks about it.
Yeah.
Especially in restaurants. So I'm wondering how you balance that, the customer is always right adage, with actual realistic expectations, especially now where expectations may have changed over the past year and a half, right, with COVID. And as you're almost relaunching yourself into the market now. How do you kind of manage that balance of expectations when everybody's expectation is different? And you may even have limited resources to be able to provide that same 110% customer service that you could maybe 2 years ago. How do you manage that balance of expectations of all your customers, regardless of industry?
So
I'll
are
throw
you
that to whoever.
asking that of me or just throwing that out?
I'm throwing that out to everyone. I want to hear everyone's thought on that.
Well, I would say that where I've worked, we've always been very good about managing expectations. And part of what allows you to do that is you develop trust with your customer base. So trust gives you the latitude to basically call people out if they're being unreasonable. So if you're meeting your obligation on your side, you've made your promise to your customer, you're meeting your promise, you've developed trust, then when the customer comes in and says, hey, there's no way I'm going to wait 2 weeks for my product, I need to have it tomorrow, you can honestly, and you can kind of take the moral high ground, if you will, and say, you realize that this product is custom made per order, so delivery tomorrow might be impossible. I'll be happy to take a look at it, but you have to, as politely as you can say it, is you're asking for something that is outside of the realm of what's normal. But you're not saying no. And a lot of this just goes to frontline training. The people that have to speak to the customers directly on a regular basis have to have the latitude based on their relationships to be able to say when the customer is being unreasonable or not. And you don't have to be mean about it. You don't have to be, bullying about it. It's just say, look, we've always upheld our end of the bargain. You need to uphold your end of the bargain as well. And I've had these kinds of conversations with customers that have been unreasonable. They received a box load of product. They dropped it, broke everything. They want a warranty replacement. Well, sorry, that was on you, it wasn't on us. We'll work with you on replacing product, but you have to own up to your responsibilities as a good customer as well.
That's a tough conversation to have with somebody, I'm sure.
It is, but if you have a good relationship and a long-term relationship, you can have that conversation.
That's a great point, and the trust piece is really a key point there. If you don't have trust, you really have nothing, right? Doesn't matter how good your service is, you have to build the trust.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, Kathy and Danny, I know that there's never anybody that's unreasonable in a restaurant. Everybody's always completely reasonable and rational. If their steak is cooked wrong, I know that they're very polite about it, I'm sure, right? If you get the order wrong, I'm sure they're very polite about it all the time. But how is, of course, I'm being facetious, because we've seen some people in restaurant situations where if they don't get if there's a mistake or an issue, it's literally like, the life just changed forever for them. But how is what Scott's saying applicable to the restaurant industry? As far as, customers feeling valued, trusted, they may be regulars, they may come in once, every so often. How does that apply to you?
So I think Danny should lead with this, directly being in the restaurant, and I can add, from the industry standpoint, my thoughts.
Okay, I think if we want to start with the expectation side, that is incredibly hard for us to control. It's everyone, each individual. Expectation is such a subjective, idea where it depends on the individual what their expectations are for any restaurant, right? Even with the 3 different groups of restaurants we have, I think one person might have different expectations for each one of them, and what those models are. Our job is to provide consistency so that when a guest comes in, be it for the first time or repeatedly, that we're providing the same experience day in and day out, regardless of who they are or when they come in. And I think that's how you start to build that trust. That's how you start to manage some of those customer expectations, where they know that we are consistent in our product and our service. In terms of how you started off with the customer is always right. Again, that is the oldest mantra in the restaurant industry, is the customer is always right. But we're also in a day and age where we are trying to change the culture of restaurants. We're trying to change the environment of restaurants. And part of that is how to deal with guests who are overly demanding, and sometimes what is not talked about are the systemic racial bias that happens from the guest standpoint to staff, right? And how they treat staff, how they address staff. And that is something that we as an industry are trying to combat and educate, the general consumers about how their actions can be deflating to an individual, that is serving them. So I believe there is a point where we are trying to at least shift the conversation from, we will bend over backwards and make sure that you have a great time and that we're meeting your expectations, but we are going to also make sure that you are treating our staff in a very fair and equitable manner.
I just have to ask you one question on that, because that could be a whole show right there. And I think Barbara has a question on that coming up here in a second, but before we get to Kathy, I want to get your perspective on that as well. So are you saying that so people come in with maybe biases, right? From the outside world, nothing to do with the restaurant, nothing to do with that server, but based on how that server looks or how that server speaks, you're saying that they may treat them in a certain way. Is that
so? So for instance, at Anju, our executive chef there is an amazing individual named Angel Barreto. He is African American and Puerto Rican. Obviously, does not look Korean. And when when a guest will walk in, regardless of race, they'll come in and look at Angel and be like, "You're the chef here, at a Korean restaurant?" And he gets that all the time, right? Because there's a bias that, you have to be, for a restaurant as well known as we are, that, executive chef has to be Korean, right? From our staff, right? I remember when we first opened up Mandu, if I would be at the front door, just happen to be at the front door and someone will come in, they'll look at me and assume that I didn't speak English, right? So, they would use wild hand gestures and speak really slowly and be like, "Can I see the menu?" And I'd be like,
Oh my.
"Here's the menu." I can understand that, so small little acts, right, that compound and build and build and build, where, I think we're at a tipping point now where we are trying to, again, inform and educate the general public of how their actions can be deemed to be biased, at a restaurant setting.
It's also important to note, I think, that this is happening in Washington, D.C., which happens to be a very diverse community.
In a very liberal city.
Well, exactly. So if it's happening in D.C., a liberal city, with a lot of diversity. Can you imagine other areas of the country or the world where maybe it's not as diverse?
And again, this doesn't happen all the time, and so in general, and I think every restaurant will say this. In general, most of our guests, the majority of our guests are great, right? All it takes though is that 0.5%, of guests who come in and create a scene, and that's what stays with you. That's what stings, and that's all you can think about even a year later. Is that everyone can remember. Hey, remember on this day, 2 years ago when that customer did this. It's hard to remember even last week, like, oh, remember the 200 great guests we had, and remember what they, we did for them. It's always that negative experience that stays with you.
Yeah.
That happens to the customer too. You remember the bad meals sometimes more than you remember the good ones, which is kind of ironic. We're starting to wind things down a little bit. Kathy, I want to get your perspective, then I want to pass it back to Barbara because I know you have some more.
No, you bet. I mean, I think if we were to break it down into, there's expectation and then there's customer service, or customers always being right. With expectation, I mean, again, Barbara probably has good thoughts and bad thoughts back from the chamber, but we have 1,400 operators who during this time in particular, we were dealing with every single day in some way, text, email, phone calls, my team. I had to throw away the expectation piece of it because everybody brought their own sense of this is what needs to be happen. This is how we need to move forward. It was a lot of distinguishing what makes sense at this moment versus what we need to engage in as we go forward. That was a tough one. I mean, managing those expectations were really tough. In terms of the customer always being right, it ties into that. My customers are owners, operators. They're not always right. They're not, period. They're not always right. But of course, most importantly, we are here to listen as we have this community of restaurateurs. Now, for the restaurants with their diners and customers, it's similar to my employees in dealing with food service professionals, restaurant owners and operators. In a day when kindness is going to matter more than ever, if you are unkind or you're intentionally offensive, or you are bringing your own drama into an experience in a restaurant towards a server, towards an employee, they're not always right. And I do think that this is going to be a very interesting reset, not just for our industry, but as a larger business community in the region. We have to be much more intentional. And thankfully, I'm not in the government where I have to worry about the politics of that.
Right.
I really hope that people are stepping up to be very intentional about what is right and what is wrong. I do empathize with the Dannies of the world who may have the difficult diners coming in, but what we know is for the most part, diners love their restaurants in this town. Mm-hmm. They love them, but you are going to have those occasions where people walking into your space, you have to feel that you can say, you know what, this kind of behavior is not tolerated here. And I hope that that is not more the case as we go forward, but we have to feel that we can be together as a community on that point to draw boundaries, because that's the only way we're going to push the kind of change that needs to happen, at least in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area.
Good point. Good point.
Yeah, I think that that speaks to another issue, which is that when we really emerge from this post-pandemic world, we're going to find that the most successful companies are the ones that have what I call a sort of an organizational agility, because so many things have happened in the last year. I think the pandemic was a trigger for a lot of things, like shining a light on the lack of diversity in industry and the insensitivity to those issues. And so I think that's the big challenge that's coming up, is for companies, no matter where they are, is to be agile in the sense of being willing to relook at their business model, adjust to something that's going to be more sustainable, and then act very quickly on that. And that's a thing that I see a lot of companies struggling with. Just the idea of having to do that is a struggle for them.
Mhm.
But that's the future is going to belong to those companies that develop that sort of organizational velocity in terms of making decisions and moving forward.
Right. Interesting. I want to tell you an experience that I had yesterday, just a comment. On Friday, I had remembered that I had not ordered flowers for a relative in New Jersey of my late husband's. And so rather than trying to go online, but called around to florists in the area in New Jersey to see who could commit that they could deliver them Saturday or Sunday at the latest. So we found one, and they charged an enormous $45 delivery fee. On top of it was almost as much as the flowers themselves. So when I talked to the relative Saturday night, she didn't mention she had received anything at all. So yesterday morning, my assistant started calling this florist, and you could not get through. You go to voicemail hell, and you just in all of these loops, and you could never get to anybody. So when she put the order number in, they said, well, it's out for delivery today, but somebody will call you. That was yesterday morning. By 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, nobody had called. So I got on the phone and I kept going through all the loops until I got to somebody. Finally picked up somebody, I answered the phone, and they said, well, it's being delivered now. I said, so is that why you didn't call me this morning? Because I was going to cancel it. Well, it's being delivered right now. Well, we told you when you called that we would deliver up to the 11th. I said, no, that's not what you said, or else I would not have placed the order. And so we went back and forth on this. The guy was nice enough, but patronizing to say that I made the mistake when I placed the order and that I should have known. So finally, apparently they record all the conversations. So while I'm on the phone, he goes and listens to the recording. And he says, well, yes, we did commit to you that we would have the order. I said, well, I'm just not happy about this at all, because I would have gone someplace else had you not made this commitment. He was decent to me, but again, it was the flowers weren't delivered by Mother's Day, which
Right.
was when I wanted them delivered, or else. And then on top of that, I paid the $45 delivery fee to have it expedited to get there. So at the end of the day, I still had to pay for the flowers because they got delivered, and they didn't get delivered until 6 o'clock last night. And so that's an example of why this is one of my pet peeves on top of that. So not good.
Well, and
customer
it also highlights that when you have a bad customer service experience,
Yeah, I
you
won't use
really
them
want to
again.
tell people about that.
Yeah, and I told them that I won't use them again. And I order flowers
Yeah,
for
they've
her
lost your
often.
business
Yeah,
and maybe some future opportunities.
yeah, that's right.
Well,
That's right.
to that point, here's again. I know we are winding down here. Really, we could talk about this all day. But to that point, like for example, now with like social media and Yelp and all that, Barbara could easily go on, right, and give a
Yeah.
bad review. Barbara, you're so nice. I don't know if you even do that, but
Probably won't.
but
No.
people do that. So how does that impact, how people sort of interact with their customers? Is it in the back of their mind knowing that, oh, if I act this way, I'm going to end up on Facebook as like, an example of what not to be? Do they think about that? Because now there's so much more recourse now.
Right.
And you can actually people have sometimes, you see a lot of with the airlines, right?
Mhm.
The airline will give you vouchers because this person complained on Twitter and
Mhm.
and there was a ton of people responded and they had their back and everything like that. Is that something that's in consideration now? Technology and digital and social media and everything?
Again, I'm going to let Danny, I will just
Yeah.
say 1000%, but I will let Danny answer that, being in the trenches of that. My answer is 1000%.
Yeah, we if I didn't do what I did for a living, I would not have social media. I'll just say
Right.
that right now. But since we do, I have Instagram and Twitter, so I can track what's being said about the restaurants, and
Mhm.
it is a huge piece to our customer service aspect of our business now.
Oh, absolutely.
You have guests who will direct message the restaurant account. I mean, who'd already made a reservation can actually use a reservation platform to make a change, but they'll use Instagram direct messaging to say, oh, we're 30 minutes late, instead of calling or emailing or using any other method, right?
Right.
So it requires actually uh, uh, at least an individual or a team to manage all those accounts. So you have fast responses, back to guests who have legitimate inquiries, on these social media platforms.
So you
And
have to hire somebody. I mean, somebody's got to be managing that all the time.
so what's emerged is there are social media marketing companies,
Ah,
who they have teams
okay.
uh, or huge staff that manages accounts for restaurants, and one of the things they provide is the uh, responses to direct messaging, on
Okay.
social.
Okay.
We also, emails are also hugely important. If a guest had an issue, especially during COVID, right, during takeout,
Mhm.
because again, at a restaurant, you're able to immediately correct a problem if there is one, right? Say
Sure.
that a server comes by, checks on the table. Takeout, you don't have that opportunity until maybe 30 minutes after it left the restaurant, when a guest finally gets into the box, starts eating it, and they're like, oh, this wasn't what I expected.
Right.
They then send an email or a call or a social media message, a tweet, an Instagram message saying, hey, just so that you all know, this wasn't, great. I will say that again, the majority of those responses have been more constructive, right? Especially during COVID, they have said, we know you all are struggling. This is just a favor. We're not asking for anything. We just want to let you know because we love you guys. We just want to make sure this doesn't happen to another guest, right? And
Very good.
we have no problem and no issues, and we will immediately write back to them, thanking them for that, apologizing, and even sending a gift card or help them get a reservation the next time they come in, any number of factors. But I think it needs to be, whenever we do get those messages, I think it's important not to have a robotic response.
Right.
It
Right.
needs to be personal.
Personal.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's really obvious when it's a formulaic response.
Right.
I think if you're going to do that, you might as well just not respond.
Right.
You have to have that personal touch, and this ties us back to the original point of this conversation, which is customer service.
Mhm.
Right? And that was a way we found during COVID to still have that sense of customer service, even when we had 0 guests in the house, was through emails, through social media, through every single other avenue where we could reach guests, was to have that personal touch.
Very
That's
excellent.
huge. That is huge, being able to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Something like 3/4 of the people that have had a bad customer service experience, it's been at the front end where they haven't even talked to a person yet. They've been shuttled around through voicemail hell, and
Yeah.
that is one of the absolute worst things that you can do in terms of customer service.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I think that I want to pose my last question and comment to Danny. I understand that you have been very engaged in pushing back on the Asian hate that's been going around the country, quite frankly, here in Washington. And I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about your work and kind of what the experience has been for you.
Yeah. So I'm hesitant to say my work. What I've been trying to do is be as vocal as I possibly can be,
Mhm.
to first raise awareness to a lot of the general population that didn't know this was happening to the Asian American.
Sure. Sure.
It wasn't being covered on CNN, wasn't being covered on the Washington Post, New York Times, back when when it started. So we felt a little helpless in terms of, we felt invisible. There was nothing highlighting the danger that was happening to our community, and it was getting worse and worse and worse. So I got extremely depressed and frustrated about the silence of it. So I started to try to educate whoever followed me personally, of what was happening, and the amount of responses I got from friends even, right, who were like, oh my God, I had no idea, highlighted to me the need to keep the foot on the gas, right, and to be more vocal. So what we decided to do, this is probably about 2 weeks before the Atlanta shootings. I talked to my team at Anju, and I was like, we should do a special dinner where we can pick a organization and raise funds for that organization. But I wanted to do it not just for the Asian American community, but find a group that was trying to bring unity in the fight against racism as a whole. So I think that's very important, is that even though there was a highlight recently, finally, on the racism against Asians right now, it's not like racism stopped against every other community.
Exactly
And
right.
there's been this dangerous finger pointing going on between fringe groups of different communities, pointing each other, being like, well, where was your support then, or why aren't you supporting us now? And I thought there's some very disruptive rhetoric that was happening. And what I wanted to highlight was the strength in our unity, the strength in our diversity to combat this plague of racism. So I found this wonderful group called Embrace Race, which is a nonprofit organization that provides resources to educators, parents, counselors, provides resources to them to help them teach young children about how to be anti-bias, anti-racist, through education. And it really struck a chord with me, because it was, how better of a way to try to attack and prevent these problems in the future by exposing children at a very young age and taking that veil off, right? And saying, yeah, we do have problems in this country.
Right.
We do have problems with bias. We have problems with racism. This is how you address that, and this is how we can fix it. And these are going to be the future leaders of our country, So that to me was an amazing organization. So I met the founders over Zoom. We had an hour-long call, and I think they wanted to make sure I wasn't crazy. But we ended up doing this amazing dinner where we had 8 chefs, and we raised in one night $20,000 at 25% capacity.
Right.
Oh,
To
fantastic.
Embrace Race, which was great. And I'm actually in San Diego right now. I'm actually cooking at dinner tonight that's raising funds for Embrace Race.
Oh, wonderful. Well, congratulations on that terrific work.
Oh, thank you.
Just when Kathy mentioned how involved you were with that, I said, well, I want to make sure I get a comment and a question in about that to promote that work. So that's terrific.
Barbara, I'll take you to the next one when they have
Okay.
one.
All right, that's a date.
That's a date.
I've been totally vaccinated, and I can go out now. So
Great, me
We'll get the
too.
margaritas ready.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think that's all the time that we have for today. This subject is so important and can be so very personal, as I just told you, my personal story, that we could probably go on for another hour. Scott, Kathy, and Danny, thank you so much. We appreciate your sharing your expertise, your time, and your experiences with Brian and I and our viewing audience. All the best to you as you move forward, and looking forward to, with the mayor's order announcement yesterday, that the restaurants can really move forward, because hospitality, at least for Washington, D.C., is a really, really big deal. And we look forward to having you all at full capacity sometime soon. A reminder to our audience, if you are looking to continue your leadership quest for knowledge, please visit our website, www.langstrategies.com, and view our Lang Leader Class series. Also, I have a new book out, Madam President, Leadership Lessons from the Top of the Ladder, and it can be found on Amazon. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We hope to see you next time for another edition of Barbara's Banter. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much.